Good morning. Everyone enjoying their breakfast here? My name is Jeffrey Blankford, and I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of IRMEP's Mordechai Benunu Open Nuclear Dialogue Initiative. It's on a conference on Israel's nuclear arsenal, espionage, opacity, and future. I call this historic because even to publicly acknowledge that Israel has developed and been sitting on several hundred nuclear weapons for the past 2 or 3 decades is something that no sitting president or member of Congress has ever summoned the courage to acknowledge. And that includes, unfortunately, President Obama. This silence persists even while the President and Congress have just added additional sanctions against Iran to those already existing, clearly intended to bring Tehran's economy to a standstill. And for what? For perhaps, but not for sure, building a nuclear weapon that Israel developed through deception and theft, and whose existence it has refused to admit for the past 40 years. This silence persisted during the May 2010 review conference of the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons held at the UN headquarters in May 2010, at which the Obama administration agreed only to discuss making the Middle East nuclear-free zone at the next review conference, 2002. Now, yesterday, the President welcomed Prime Minister Netanyahu, what was described by Dana Milbank in today's Washington Post as a surrender to Israel. And this is what Obama said yesterday in his meeting with Netanyahu. Quote, "Finally, we discussed issues that arose out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Conference. And I reiterated to the Prime Minister that there is no change in U.S. policy when it comes to these issues. We strongly believe that given its size, its history, the region that it's in, and the threats that are leveled against us, against it, that Israel has unique security requirements. It's got to be able to respond to threats of any combination of threats in the region. And that's why we remain unwavering in our commitment to Israel's security. And the United States will never ask Israel to take any steps that would undermine their security interests." The wall of silence from the White House and Congress has long been attributed to an unwritten agreement made between President Richard Nixon and Prime Minister Golda Meir back in December 1969, never formally announced, in which Washington agreed not to comment on Israel's nuclear weapons program as long as Israel did not openly test weapons or declare or acknowledge their existence. The criteria was, that was the basis for the strategic ambiguity of not introducing nuclear weapons to the region. A more likely reason is that had the United States acknowledged that Israel had nuclear weapons, that would have required under U.S. law the freezing of all aid to Israel. And we know that's not going to happen. That Congress has also observed this agreement, to which it was not a party, is an indication that there are larger forces at work here. And you'll hear more about them from today's speakers. And this leads to a question sometimes asked partly in jest: which is the more important occupied territory for Israel, Washington or the West Bank? You'll probably have a better understanding of that before you leave than you do now if you don't already have come to a conclusion on that. The same code of congressional silence that keeps our representatives mum about Israel's nuclear arsenal is also enforced in the case of Israeli whistleblower Mordechai Benunu, in whose honor today's event is being staged. Mordechai Benunu, you may recall, had worked for nearly 10 years, from 1976 to 1985, as a technician at the Negev Nuclear Research Center near Dimona in southern Israel. After converting to Christianity in the early 80s, he became increasingly troubled by the nature of his work and concluded that the building of weapons of mass destruction was morally wrong. He left the Dimona Center in Israel to travel around the world, but not before taking photographs of what he saw while working at Israel's nuclear weapons factory. These photographs would later appear in the London Sunday Times after he ran into a Times reporter who he met in Australia. The Israeli response might have been predictable. Vanunu was lured to Rome by a beautiful Mossad agent, where he was drugged, kidnapped, and smuggled back to Israel. In a trial that was held behind closed doors, he was sentenced to 18 years, the first 11 of which he served in solitary confinement. Vanunu was finally released in April 2004, but was forbidden to travel outside Israel to meet with foreign journalists or foreign nationals of any sort, or own any kind of communications equipment, from a computer to a cell phone. I was fortunate enough to be in Jerusalem in 2004 to spend a morning with Vanunu, and I found him a wonderful, warm human being. He was the man who Daniel Ellsberg, whistleblower of some note, referred to as the preeminent hero of the nuclear era. Vanunu has since been sent back to prison several times for speaking with foreign journalists. At this very moment, he is again in an Israeli prison for the very same reason. On May 12th, 11 days before his current sentence was announced, Amnesty International issued a press release which said, quote, "If Mordechai Vanunu is imprisoned again, Amnesty International will declare him to be a prisoner of conscience and call for his immediate and unconditional release," end quote. On June 18th, it did just that. I was unable to find a single mainstream U.S. publication that published the Amnesty Report International statement. And as I said earlier, there are larger forces at work here. A moment ago I mentioned at the U.S. Congress, which has a long history of holding the fate of Israeli prisoners near and dear to its heart, has made an exception in Vanunu's case. I bring this up because at the end of June, both houses of Congress passed by unanimous consent resolutions calling on Hamas to release an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, who was captured 4 years ago on the Israeli border with Gaza, and while manning a battle station which regularly shelled the people of besieged Gaza. You may also not be surprised to learn that Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, from out my way in California, brags about carrying a copy of the dog tags of Gilad Shalit with her wherever she goes. I can't think of a better symbol for the state of affairs in Washington than that. It's been this way for many years, and unfortunately is likely to continue to be that way unless we do something about it. It is more than appropriate, by the way, that this event is being held in an international spy museum. Since much of what you're going to hear today deals with deliberate deception practiced by the State of Israel regarding its nuclear program that have far more serious implications for the United States than ordinary espionage, although there is some of that involved as well. On your way in, you may have noticed in the glass wall of declassified documents released under the Freedom of Information Act. But many documents that should populate that wall are missing, since the CIA and FBI continue to cover up information dealing with U.S.-Israel nuclear dealings. I can speak from personal experience as an espionage target, having been one of some 10,000 individuals and a member of more than one of some 600 organizations in Northern California alone that were spied on by a man, Erwin Sewell, who is the late head of the Intelligence Department of the Anti-Defamation League, referred to as, quote, my chief fact finder. Now, it's a matter of public knowledge, but not widely known, that an investigation by the FBI and the San Francisco Police Department in the early 90s revealed that the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, or formerly part of B'nai B'rith, had been conducting for some years a massive spying operation on individuals and organizations throughout the United States. While a portion of these activities were devoted to exposing the activities of skinheads and neo-Nazi groups that operate at the margins of society, the major focus of that chief fact finder, a man by the name of Roy Bullock, were Palestinian and Arab American groups and anti-apartheid activists connected to the African National Congress, including black South African exiles residing in the United States or traveling here. Most of the spied-on individuals and organizations fell into a section that Bullock labeled pinko groups. These included such organizations as the NAACP, the Asian Law Caucus, Irish Northern Aid, the American Civil Liberties Union, 20 labor unions, and Labor Committee on the Middle East, of which I was a co-founder. Bullock, who I had met after he had infiltrated the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, was one of the early people signing up for our Labor Committee on the Middle East and attended our early meetings. As it turned out, he was spying on the anti-apartheid organizations, but he was not just doing it for the Anti-Defamation League. Bullock, the investigation revealed, was also being paid for providing information to agents for South African intelligence based in the San Francisco Bay Area, after being recruited for the job by a San Francisco cop buddy of his. Spying for South Africa required no greater effort on Bullock's part, because, as he admitted during a deposition, he was already doing that for the Anti-Defamation League. And I was also an anti-apartheid activist myself, so I counted both as a pro-Palestinian activist as an anti-apartheid activist at both counts. During the 30 years Bullock had been working for the ADL, and up to his arrest and exposure, he had been paid through a cutout in Beverly Hills, a lawyer named Bruce Hochman, who was a former head of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation. When, rather than firing Bullock, when it was revealed he had been working for South Africa, or offering an apology for his spying, the ADL put him directly on their payroll. Several class action lawsuits were brought against the ADL, but only one had a measure of success. It was filed by former Congressman Pete McCloskey on behalf of those who had been targeted by Bullock for their work against both Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and against South African apartheid. The case was in litigation for about 10 years, and by the end there were 3 of us left. When all their appeals were exhausted, the ADL offered and we agreed to a settlement, with a stipulation, very important stipulation, that we would not be restricted to a confidentiality agreement, which allowed me to talk about this case. In pursuit of the case, we learned the ADL would provide information on my activities and those of my 2 plaintiffs to the governments of Israel and South Africa. A telling moment occurred during a deposition taken by Pete McCloskey, former congressman, of former Mossad agent Victor Ostrovsky, who also exposed the lack of space, which also exposed the lack of space that exists between the Anti-Defamation League and Israeli intelligence. Ostrovsky, you may recall, published 2 books about his experience with the Mossad, both bestsellers, that exposed the inner workings of the Israeli spy agency. While they provided no useful information about the ADL for us, what astonished us and astonished Ostrovsky was when the lawyers for the Anti-Defamation League demanded that Ostrovsky turn over to them the documents that he had taken when he had left the Mossad. Now here are the lawyers for American Jewish organizations demanding from this former Mossad agent that he give them the papers he had taken with them. Of course, he denied their request, but his request still is on the record. And if you want more evidence about the connection, I can't find a better piece of evidence. Of course, Ostrovsky says, excuse me, at the time you may recall, and if not, you'll learn today from one of our panelists, Sasha Polikoff-Sharansky, that South Africa had become a close ally of Israel and continued to be so, even when the apartheid regime was subject to international sanctions, and not just when it came to nuclear weapons. Here, for example, is a page from the Financial Mail of South Africa, January 31st, 1986. It's a blown-up copy of the page. The bold-faced headline reads, "The Israeli Connection." The article is illustrated by a colorful hourglass with a South African flag at the top, a Star of David symbolizing Israel in the center, and an American flag on the bottom. And that's us. It was intended to illustrate how apartheid in South Africa would benefit from the Israel-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which had been pushed by AIPAC and approved the previous December by the Reagan administration over the objections of some of America's leading corporations, such as Monsanto and Dow Chemical, which shows you the power of AIPAC and the Zionist lobby here in this country. In a large section reads, "Many companies are grasping opportunities provided by a technology agreement between South Africa and Israel. Exporting technology to the United States through Israel is one of the many advantages under a new agreement." At the time, I sent a copy of this article to the Representative Dandy Fasel, chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Fasel wrote to me that he was going to forward my letter to Lee Hamilton and Howard Wolpe, who were the chairs of the subcommittee on Europe and the Middle East and Africa, respectively. I never heard a word back from either of them, and there was no evidently any follow-up on this case. A clear violation of international sanctions and U.S. law. If you have any questions about that, our first speaker, Grant Smith, founder and director of IRMEP, the Institute for Research Middle East Policy, has in fact written a book about the spy trade disagreement. It was called Spy Trade, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer any questions during the question period. He's going to lead off our panel by describing ongoing investigations and cover-ups of how weapons-grade uranium and critical dual-use technology were illegally diverted to Israel from a factory in Pennsylvania, where it may have played a critical role in the development of Israel's nuclear weapons industry. Grant Smith is the author of several important books that document the activities of AIPAC, its American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and its predecessors, including Deadly Dogma, How Neoconservatives Broke the Law to Deceive America, Foreign Agents, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the 1963 Fulbright hearings to the 2005 espionage scandal, America's Defense Line, the Justice Department's battle to register the Israel lobby as agents of a foreign government, and spy trade. Following Grant, you're going to hear from Sasha Polakoff-Saransky, a senior editor for Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council for Foreign Relations, whose new book, The Unspoken Alliance-Israel Secret Relationship with Apartheid South Africa, has ripped the lid off that heretofore largely untold story and includes a section dealing with the Anti-Defamation League case and Roy Bullock, and he will be signing the book after, and it'll be available to purchase after this event. And rounding off the panel, I'll have the honor of introducing Professor John Mearsheimer, the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor and co-director of the Program on International Security Policy at the University of Chicago. Professor Mearsheimer is the author of Liddell Hart and the Weight of History, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and co-author with Stephen Walt of The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, which in 2007 broke new ground in opening a discussion of what has long been one of America's most taboo subjects. This morning we are asking him to apply his cold reasoning of aggressive realism to examine whether adhering to Israel's policy of strategic ambiguity makes strategic sense to the United States, if the era of Israel's nuclear policy opacity is coming to an end, and whether Israel's possession of nuclear weapons has ever been beneficial for the United States. After all three speakers have concluded their presentations, I'll open the floor to your comments and questions. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Grant Smith. Thank you very much.
Like Jeff, I like show and tell, and after 32 years, on May 6, 2010, something rather amazing happened. The Government Accountability Office partially declassified and released a document that had been kept under wraps for about 32 years, in spite of the best efforts of researchers to dislodge it. It bears the tantalizing title of Nuclear Diversion in the U.S.? Question mark. 13 years of contradiction and confusion. Although it's been partially declassified, the researchers' quest for more information about the U.S.-Israel nuclear relationship and dislodging secrets is far from over. I'll be using this document and referring back to it at various moments as I walk through my presentation. You can find it easily now by simply Googling nuclear diversion, and it's usually one of the top 2 results. We'll explore the mechanisms and policies that have offshored one of the most awesome military powers ever devised by man, first unleashed by the United States, and how coerced ambiguity about Israel's nuclear arsenal undermines accountability here in the United States. It undermines rule of law, it undermines governance, and of course, as Jeff mentioned, this issue could not be more timely since major mainstream news outlets are trumpeting Obama's apparent acquiescence to maintaining quote-unquote strategic ambiguity in the wake of the Netanyahu visit. Since few Americans are aware of how heavily Israel relied on weapons stolen and smuggled from the United States in the past, I'd like to do a small review. In 1945, David Ben-Gurion traveled to the United States under the auspices of the Jewish Agency, which remains today one of the largest global nonprofits in the world financing and managing immigration and settlement to Israel. Ben-Gurion held a secret meeting in June of 1945 in the apartment of Rudolf Sonnenborn, gathering together 18 wealthy North American donors for his upcoming fight for independence. He solicited arms and financing. Michael Carpin reveals in his book, The Bomb in the Basement, that the donations coordinator was none other than Henry Morgenthau Jr., who had served 11 years as Secretary of Treasury in the Roosevelt administrations. Morgenthau resigned from government soon after Harry S. Truman entered office to serve as chairman of the United Jewish Appeal and later chairman of the Board of Governors of the American Financial and Development Corporation for Israel. The conventional arms smuggling network racked up an impressive record, buying for pennies on the dollar, or simply stealing in some cases, explosives, small arms, heavy machine guns, munitions-making equipment, aircraft, ships, and tanks destined for civilian conversion, well, probably not the tanks, or in many uses simply scrap under the auspices of the War Assets Administration, which was in charge of decommissioning America's immense World War II military surplus. The definitive account of this is Leonard Slater's book, The Pledge, 1970, and subsequent reports based on CIA declassification, such as Ricky Dale Calhoun's scholarly paper, The Haganah's Illegal Arms Procurement Network in the U.S. In 1958, then Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion arranged for clothing magnate Abraham Feinberg to secretly finance nuclear weapons programs in Israel, among other benedictors in the United States, according to Abner Cohen's indispensable book, Israel and the Bomb. Feinberg, a major Democratic Party donor, had organized President Harry S. Truman's whistle-stop fundraising campaign, which saved his presidential bid from certain disaster. David Lowenthal, formerly a member of the underground Haganah, fought during Israel's 1948 War of Independence under Meir Amit, who later became head of Israeli intelligence. Lowenthal, also a close friend of David Ben-Gurion, provided the venture capital to finance the purchase of the Apollo Steel Company facility in Pennsylvania for $450,000. Dr. Zalman M. Shapiro, an inventor and head of a local Zionist Organization of America chapter, became founder and president of the Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation at Apollo, Pennsylvania in 1956. Lowenthal capitalized NUMEC through a stock offering in 1957, and business took off. He had a highly talented team. NUMEC co-founder Leonard Pepkowitz had worked on the Manhattan Project, building the bomb, and later moved to the Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico. According to the secret GAO report, during the course of its operations, NUMEC received more than 22 tons of taxpayer-funded, highly enriched uranium-235, the key ingredient used for manufacturing nuclear weapons. This came from Westinghouse and the U.S. Navy. In the early 1960s, the Atomic Energy Commission began documenting suspicious lapses in NUMEC's security, inexplicably lax record-keeping, and the ongoing presence of large numbers of Israelis at the plant. In 1962, the AEC considered suspending classified weapons work at NUMEC. In 1965, An AEC audit found that NUMEC could no longer account for 220 pounds of highly enriched uranium. In 1966, the FBI opened an investigation and began monitoring NUMEC's management and Israeli visitors. On September 10, 1968, 4 Israelis visited NUMEC to discuss thermoelectric devices with Shapiro. Or at least this was the excuse their security office gave to the AEC, which had to sign off on the event. Among the approved visitors was Raphael Eitan, and at some point after Eitan's visit, 587 pounds of highly enriched uranium was classified as missing. The FBI's initial investigations in the 1960s quickly circled in on NUMEC's management, but the FBI recommendations, according to this report, were stymied. According to the GAO document, quote, the FBI became so concerned about the security risks posed by NUMEC's president that they asked the DOE whether it planned to terminate his security clearance or stop the flow of materials to NUMEC. According to the FBI's liaison with the GAO, the FBI recommended that NUMEC's operating license be taken away, unquote. However, when this request was denied, the FBI simply dropped its investigation between 1969 and 1976. The GAO investigation of NUMEC, dated 1978, came at the request of Congressman John Dingell. The GAO investigators went to awesome lengths to gain direct testimony from FBI and CIA officials and agents with direct first-hand knowledge of what had happened outside formal channels. Former deputy of the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, Carl Duckett, said the agency came to the conclusion by 1968 that, quote, the NUMEC material had been diverted by the Israelis and used in fabricating weapons, unquote. When U.S. Navy analyst Jonathan Pollard was arrested spying for Israel in 1985, Raphael Eitan's importance was finally fully understood. In 1986, investigators discovered that Eitan, who entered NUMEC in 1968, had the same birth date, 11/23/1926, as the spy handling Pollard. According to Anthony Cordesman, at that time, he said, quote, there's no conceivable reason for Eitan to have gone to the Apollo plant but for the nuclear material, unquote. Eitan is now well documented as one of Israel's top economic espionage agents for the secretive Lakam, which launched multiple clandestine operations against U.S. military and economic targets. And in the 1980s and 1990s, the U.S. continued to be a relatively easy target. Another GAO report in 1988 determined that the Department of Energy nuclear laboratories were far too open to foreign visitors. Quote, countries identified as sensitive by DOE because there is security and or proliferation risk, such as Pakistan and Israel, unquote. The report found that, quote, of 637 visitors from countries such as India, Israel, and Pakistan, the DOE required background checks for only 77, unquote. And in addition to amassing critical knowledge, other nuclear technologies freely flowed from the U.S. to Israel, including dual-use technologies such as klystrons and krytons. In May of 1985, former Air Force and NATO advisor Richard Kelly Smith, no relation, was charged by a federal grand jury with smuggling over 800 krytons to Israel. The kryton can be used to trigger nuclear weapons. Federal law forbade their sale overseas without a permit. At the time of his arrest, Smith was president of an export and engineering business in Huntington Beach, California, named Milco International Corporation. Milco provided aviation consulting through U.S. military contracts as well as sales and export facilitation. Milco had close ties with Aaron Milchan. In the early 80s, billionaire Aaron Milchan did not seem like a likely candidate for any involvement in nuclear technology smuggling. He's a dual citizen of Israel and Monaco, and close personal friend of Shimon Peres, which is a common denominator in many of these nuclear initiatives. Milchan was most widely known in the U.S. as a Hollywood film mogul. Smith jumped bail and disappeared overseas for more than a decade. Afterwards, Milchan publicly denied that he had done anything illegal during interviews with NBC News in 1982 and 1993. But in July of 2001, Smith was arrested in Costa del Sol in Malaga, Spain, and at the age of 72, extradited back to the United States and held without bail for trial in California. He was found guilty of violating Arms Export Control Act and issuing false statements to government agencies, fined to $20,000 and sentenced to 40 months in federal prison. But the big operators behind that operation walked free. This has been the recurring theme of arms and technology smuggling to Israel. Some speculate, including this GAO report, which again I advise everyone to read. It's fascinating stuff. Whether in this it says, quote, the material was diverted to Israel by NUMEC management with the assistance of the Central Intelligence Agency, or, quote, again from this report, there has been a cover-up of the NUMEC incidents by the United States government. Milchan stated, before Smith was extradited back to the United States, that, quote, there's nothing that the US and Israel do separately, unquote. But he's since gone silent about the Critons. So the question is, has the United States officially, yet secretly, been arming Israel with nuclear weapons technology? There is no evidence of that yet. In the early 1960s, as the problems for NUMEC were beginning, President John F. Kennedy, and this is something Jeff referred to, was unleashing not only a robust nuclear non-proliferation initiative, heavily targeting the Israelis, but also a law enforcement and accountability maneuver. He not only demanded US inspections of the Dimona nuclear weapons plant, but on November 21, 1962, his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, ordered Israel's elite American lobby to register as foreign agents under the Foreign Agents Registration Act after the American Zionist Council was discovered laundering tax-exempt Jewish agency funds into US lobbying and public relations campaigns. The full Department of Justice case file on that was declassified and released by the National Archives in 2008, and it now appears on the internet if you simply search for American Zionist Council. During a December 27, 1962 meeting with Foreign Minister Golda Meir, Kennedy expressed his hope that the relationship was, quote, a two-way street, unquote. Meir reassured the president that there would, quote, not be any difficulty between us on the Israeli nuclear reactor, unquote. Kennedy delivered an ultimatum to Israel on July 5, 1963, insisting that Dimona undergoes serial inspections, quote, in accord with international standards, unquote, in order to verify its peaceful intent. This occurred as a letter-writing campaign organized by the American Council for Judaism was bombarding the Kennedy Justice Department with telegrams urging that the American Zionist Council be forced to register as a foreign agent. On October 11, 1963, the DOJ gave the American Zionist Council a 72-hour deadline to register as Israel's foreign agent. Kennedy's assassination in November not only traumatized the nation, but led to the gradual reversal of both the non-proliferation effort, as applied to Israel, and foreign agent registration drive. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion's secret 1958 arrangement with Abraham Feinberg now placed Israel's key nuclear weapons benedictor in the heart of the Johnson administration. According to Seymour Hersh's excellent book, The Samson Option, quote, there's no question that Feinberg enjoyed the greatest presidential access and influence in his 20 years as a fundraiser and lobbyist with Lyndon Johnson. Documents at the Johnson Library show that even the most senior members of the National Security Council understood that any issue raised by Feinberg had to be answered, unquote. As with Truman, Feinberg played a timely and powerful role in financing Lyndon B. Johnson's election prospects. Scrutiny of Israel's nuclear weapons program gradually reversed, And the Dimona inspections regime, as documented by Cohen, soon became an embarrassing farce for both the United States and Israel. Feinberg's cash was king in the Johnson administration. As documented by Hirsch, on October 14, 1964, less than 3 weeks before presidential elections, Johnson's top administrative assistant, Walter Jenkins, was arrested in a public restroom on sexual solicitation charges. At least $250,000 Feinberg had raised for Johnson was located in Jenkins' office safe. Johnson phoned his trusted aides, Bill Moyers and Meyer Feldman, were ordered to move all the cash, which they could only do with a heavy briefcase. In a kind of ongoing global swap, Israel replenished Feinberg's coffers, as it arranged with Zalman Shapiro through sales commissions, with multi-million-dollar favors, such as a major ownership interest in Israel's Coca-Cola franchise. In 1968, Hirsch documents that Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford placed a final urgent call to Johnson, stating, quote, "Mr. President, I don't want to live in a world where the Israelis have nuclear weapons," unquote. But it was too late. President Johnson was abrupt before he hung up on Clifford, saying, "Don't bother me with this anymore." By the time Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir lobbied President Nixon to define the U.S. non-proliferation policy with an exemption of ambiguity toward Israeli nuclear weapons, Israel's stockpile and number of deployed weapons was steadily growing. So the question is, why don't any of these high-level operators ever go to jail for this kind of behavior in the United States? Why are they above the law? Few perpetrators of highly illegal conventional and nuclear smuggling activities for Israel have ever faced any meaningful consequences. The organizations and individuals of the 1940s Sonneborn Institute Haganah conventional arms smuggling network engaged in charitable activities and had front companies to cover war materiel theft and smuggling. They intertwined with sympathetic elites across U.S. politics, business, and government, which is made it all but impossible as a target for law enforcement. After some Sonneborn network members were arrested in Canada moving machine gun parts across the Canadian border, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police made a recommendation to the FBI that they should make some arrests and investigations. In 1947, leaders of the network then traveled with a high-level Jewish agency representative to Washington, D.C., and met with Robert R. Nathan, who had led the U.S. industrialization and industrial mobilization in World War II, becoming the War Production Board's chairman in 1942. And Nathan brokered a summit with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, again, had, quote, already asked the FBI to cooperate in tracking down the sources and personnel involved and maybe prosecuting, unquote. But this law enforcement initiative represented a major threat to the Sonneborn network and the Jewish agency. Nathan flatly told the FBI director that the network's activities were not all, quote, anything damaging to the United States, but it's not straight up and above board. Some prominent people and some important organizations could be hurt, unquote. Nathan was presumably referring to Morgenthau, Feinberg, and other key fundraisers, as well as the politicians they patronized so lavishly. Nathan left the meeting feeling the FBI director was sympathetic, but with no indication that Hoover would cooperate. But Nathan turned out to be right. And over time, the criminal records of all the low-level Sonneborn smugglers who were actually caught were expunged. John F. Kennedy pardoned Hank Greenspun in 1961 after winning over Feinberg and the lobby to support his presidential election campaign. Bill Clinton pardoned Al Schwimmer, who smuggled aircraft and later headed up Israeli aircraft industries in the year 2000. Even though Schwimmer never personally applied for a pardon or expressed any contrition for his action, which are usually requirements for a presidential pardon. Charles Winters, the only network member to serve a meaningful prison sentence for smuggling bombers, was posthumously pardoned on December of 2008 by President George W. Bush after an intense lobbying campaign by such prominent Americans as Steven Spielberg, eager to repair the historical record. Pulling out all the stops to spring those accused of wrongdoing is also pretty well documented. In 2009, former NASA scientist Stuart Nosetti, who held high satellite and nuclear security clearances, was allegedly observed engaged in specific activities or suspicious activities and then stung by the FBI. He allegedly offered to spy for the Mossad in exchange for money. He's currently jailed in extreme conditions that restrict his outside communications. He can't even meet with his wife because she's a lawyer. Nevertheless, before all the facts are known or a trial date set, former AIPAC Executive Director and Department of Justice employee Neil Scher has publicly called for an uprising before Nosetti is prosecuted, urging that, quote, leaders of the Jewish community raise some hell and not show the timidity with which, unfortunately, characterized many responses to the AIPAC case involving Steve Rosen and Keith Weissman, unquote. And I could talk for 3 hours about that, but I won't. Not so publicly, the same lobbying is occurring to correct the historical record on diversions to Israel's nuclear weapons program, right now, as we speak, and I'll get to that in a moment. But first, what is the cost of strategic ambiguity to Americans? U.S. presidents, including Obama, have generally acquiesced to Israel's demands that its nuclear arsenal never be acknowledged or openly discussed. But strategic ambiguity and secrecy have had devastating effects on rule of law and governance in the United States. Refusing to declassify many key documents under FOIA and mandatory declassification review processes, including appeals to ISCAP, and through lack of candid, honest, and open discussions, U.S. administrations have thwarted informed citizen advice and consent in the process of governance. By refusing to acknowledge Israel's nuclear weapons, as Jeff mentioned, the Symington and Glenn amendments to the 1961 Foreign Assistance Acts, which banned the country's trafficking in nuclear technologies, have also been thwarted. The will of the people expressed through Congress has been rendered moot. And similarly, American nuclear non-proliferation treaty efforts are considered hypocritical by the rest of the world. On an international level, Israel's arsenal can and has been repeatedly used to extort U.S. conventional military aid and concessions under the threat that Israel would have to resort to its nuclear capability if ever denied. This is well documented as well by Avner Cohen, but using far more diplomatic language. It is this major but generally unmentioned factor in the brewing crisis about Iran's nuclear program. If Americans were properly informed, they might ask whether the current drive to isolate Iran through economic warfare and saber-rattling has as an underlying objective the preservation of Israeli nuclear dominance. Unprosecuted illicit activities in the U.S. that helped create Israel's arsenal, espionage, secrecy, and theft, not only undermined governance in America, but rule of law. If reports about Obama's acquiescence to strategic ambiguity are true, presumably the U.S. government will now retain any key documents that are long overdue for declassification and release. Not for any legitimate reason, but simply because they would prove that sensible policies, including non-proliferation, have been derailed and that our representative form of government has been rendered utterly irrelevant on this question. So strategic ambiguity from this point of view is a cover-up of the privatization or offshoring of America's most closely guarded nuclear force. Obama's new and unprecedented orders for freedom of information will probably no longer apply. The drive to extend the cover-up is now extended beyond the CIA and FBI right into the United States Senate. Last week, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission released, well, I won't show you, but here it is. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission released documents to me under the Freedom of Information Act. Today you can find them on the irmep.org website. On August 27, 2009, Senator Arlen Specter wrote to Rebecca Schmidt asking that the NRC, quote, issue a formal public statement confirming that he, his constituent, Zalman Shapiro, former head of NUMEC, was not involved in any activities related to the diversion of uranium to Israel, unquote. A March 2010 audit by two former NRC officials, which was published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, confirmed not only that 337 kilograms of NUMEC highly enriched uranium are still unaccounted for, but that all the circumstantial evidence still points to diversion to Israel. Last week, Senator Specter's staffer charged with clearing Shapiro confirmed that they're not seeking full release of all FBI and CIA documents about the NUMEC diversion, but rather only a formal NRC clearance of Shapiro. To date, to its credit, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has fought back against this campaign, this improper campaign, to absolve NUMEC without a full truth commission and release of all related FBI and CIA documents. And that moment of truth is clearly overdue. In closing, the GAO, John Dingell, and Congress always intended that the report, Nuclear Diversion in the US, be a public document to spur discussions about questions of diversion and US government involvement. Sections of it are censored by the CIA and FBI. Americans who understand how ambiguity harms a democratic form of government should reject the suppression of open debate and accountability that are, for us, the core attributes of strategic ambiguity. Thank you.
Everyone, thank you for coming. Can you hear me all right in the back?
Yeah.
My focus this morning is going to be much more narrow than my fellow panelists. I'm going to talk to you about the Israeli-South African connection and how Israel assisted South Africa's nuclear program and how South Africa assisted Israel's. I'll also make reference to the NUMEC case and some of the deception of US weapons inspectors during the 1960s. But I'm not going to broaden my discussion to the extent that Jeffrey and Grant did. I don't fully share the views of some of my fellow panelists here, and I will make some comments regarding AIPAC in the 1980s and the general history of weapons diversions to Israel. But let me begin with the South African connection. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973 is when we really see a powerful relationship take hold between Israel and South Africa. Prior to that, there were connections, there were discussions, often through the embassies in France, but you don't see an actual alliance and widespread exchanges and a lucrative military relationship begin until immediately after the Yom Kippur War. And in the early 1970s, this relationship was managed by Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin. It was started by key officials in the Labor Party, not on the Israeli right. In subsequent years after Likud came to power in 1977, people like Menachem Begin and key military officials affiliated with the Likud party became major players. But the relationship began under Labor, and Peres was the architect of it, much as he had been the architect of Israel's relationship with France during the 1950s that enabled Israel's early nuclear development. Now, the South African connection was a two-way street, and that's something that's very important to realize. A lot of people who've written on this relationship in the past have regarded it as a one-way relationship, a relationship in which Israel supplied South Africa with advanced weaponry and fortified the apartheid regime. And this is true. Israel, between 1973 and up until Mandela's inauguration in 1994, did supply South Africa with massive amounts of weaponry and also assisted South Africa with the development of delivery systems for its nuclear arsenal. But there was trade in the other direction too, and that's something that hasn't been acknowledged in earlier histories. And I want to go into one specific case of that trade in the other direction from South Africa to Israel. And it's something that began in the early 1960s, at a time when the Israeli government was actually quite hostile toward the apartheid regime in South Africa. You have to remember that in the era of Golda Meir and David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli government spoke out quite forcefully and openly at the UN and in other international fora against apartheid in South Africa. They did it so often and so forcefully that it angered the South African Jewish community, which felt that its own security was jeopardized by the Israeli government's stance against apartheid. And it was during these years that the first exchanges of South African uranium, sales of South African uranium to Israel took place. It began in '62, it was formalized in 1965, and throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, as the military relationship became stronger, South Africa was shipping tons of yellowcake uranium to Israel. However, that uranium was placed under bilateral safeguards. These weren't IAEA safeguards. This was an explicit agreement between the heads of state and the nuclear regulatory commissions in both countries. And South Africa would send inspectors to Israel to look and make sure each year that the barrels of uranium that they had sent to Israel were being used for solely peaceful purposes and weren't being fed into Dimona for nuclear weapons purposes in Israel. And this went on throughout the 60s and early 70s. Now, in April 1976, South African Prime Minister John Vorster went on a public visit to Israel, and it was the first moment in the history of this Israeli-South African relationship when it actually came out into the open. And it was also a jarring moment for many people in South Africa, especially South African Jews, even some people in my own family. My grandparents were German Jewish refugees who came to South Africa in the 1930s. My parents were both born there. And in 1976, when Vorster shows up in Israel and visits the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial, this was an incredibly sickening moment for many South African Jews because Vorster had been an overt Nazi sympathizer during the 1930s and 1940s. And now, 30 years later, he's being given a full red carpet treatment at the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. And such was the irony and the paradox of the Israeli-South African relationship. So in addition to visiting Yad Vashem in '76, Vorster also went and visited Israel Aircraft Industries, met with naval officials, and went on his first real shopping spree for Israeli arms, something that would continue in subsequent years. But more important than Vorster's visit was a different one a few months later, in July 1976, just a month after the Soweto riots in South Africa that left dozens of black protesters dead and really drew the world's attention to the brutality of apartheid for the first time. In July 1976, South Africa's Minister of Mines was sent on a trip to Israel. His name was Fani Botha, and at the time, he was considered a contender for the prime minister position in future years, a serious political player in the South African cabinet. And Botha was sent by Vorster and key military officials, and his task was to lift the safeguards that had been placed on those tons and tons of uranium that had been shipped from South Africa to Israel over the years. That uranium had not been used yet, but in early 1976, the Israeli Scientific Intelligence Establishment, the Lakam, headed by Benjamin Bloomberg, requested that Vorster instruct his cabinet officials to lift the safeguards because this large stockpile of South African yellowcake that had built up in Israel from 1962 up until 1976 was needed for military purposes by Israel's security establishment. And so Vorster sent his mining minister, Fani Botha, and during this visit, and this is confirmed on Israeli Ministry of Defense letterhead that was declassified by the South African military archives, Fani Botha met with Shimon Peres, he met with Yitzhak Rabin, he met with all of the key nuclear officials, generals like Chaim Bar-Lev, and despite the fact that the press in Israel and South Africa passed it off as a discussion of new mining ventures, the real purpose of this visit was to lift the safeguards. And those documents tell most of the story, but I decided to get it from the protagonist himself. And so I went to interview Fani Botha a few years ago when I was doing research for this book. And he told me, and just bear with me for a second here while I find the quote, his memory of the deal was clear. He said, I didn't sell it to them, I didn't give it to them, but when I became minister, they had it. They couldn't use it unless South Africa lifted them, the safeguards, so that's what I did. He didn't seem very troubled by the effects of his actions, that they may have aided proliferation, and he told me we were good friends. We worked together for some years. It was easy for friends to cooperate in this field. And that is how the stockpile of South African uranium, which at that point was between 500 and 600 tons, was freed for Israeli use at Dimona. Now, the NUMEC case that my fellow panelists have discussed occurs at roughly the same time, and therefore is important. My book went to press before the Victor Galinsky article that Grant referred to came out in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. That article argues that the diversion from the US was a key factor in aiding Israel's program. Based on the evidence I had, I was skeptical of this because Israel's program has always relied primarily on plutonium devices and not on highly enriched uranium devices. This article has uncovered some new materials and new documents, and of course the writers of the article are experts who were insiders at the NRC at the time, and showed that Israel may have been hedging its bets at this point in history and trying to acquire both highly enriched uranium and build its own plutonium-based devices, and therefore diverted material from NUMEC would have been useful. The other diversion that takes place around this time, a little bit earlier, is in 1968, and some of you may be familiar with this. It's called the Plumbat Affair. And this involved yellowcake uranium that was channeled from Europe to Israel in an intelligence operation, during which the Israelis used a Liberian front company to purchase a ship called the Shearsburg A, and they created a false Italian recipient for the cargo, and they packed yellowcake uranium into barrels labeled plumbat, which is a word for a lead derivative. And the ship went from Antwerp to Rotterdam, and in Rotterdam the original crew was dismissed and replaced with an Israeli crew. And the ship sailed out into the Mediterranean, and when it got near Cyprus, there was a transfer at sea where Israeli naval vessels approached the ship, removed the material on the ship, and dropped it in Haifa, while the Shearsburg A sailed on towards a port in Turkey and showed up with no cargo and many pages mysteriously missing from its logbook about a week later. Now this was Israel's last documented diversion of nuclear materials. It took place in 1968. It was 200 tons of yellowcake, and by the time 1976 rolled around, according to my sources for the book, Israel was in need of new raw material for its nuclear program, and that is precisely why they placed such pressure on South Africa in 1976 to lift the safeguards that I just discussed. Now, it wasn't just a matter of lifting the safeguards. There was also a quid pro quo. In exchange for this help that Israel received from the South African government, they provided tritium to the South Africans, which is a substance used to boost the yield of advanced thermonuclear devices. And the South Africans hadn't built such a device yet, but they were planning to, and their research and development efforts were focused on both miniaturizing the warheads that they were working on and building new delivery systems and building more advanced thermonuclear devices. And they hoped to have such devices in the coming years by the mid-1980s, and saw tritium as a vital ingredient for those next generation nuclear devices. So the Israeli government provided South Africa with 30 grams of tritium between 1976 and 1978, and this was documented in an in-camera trial in the South African Supreme Court years later in the 1980s, involving Fani Botha and the middleman in the uranium deal in Israel, who, in exchange for his services on behalf of the South African state, had demanded diamond mining rights from the Ministry of Mines, which Fani Botha headed. And when he didn't receive those diamond mining concessions, he threatened to go public with the details of this entire deal that I've just described to you. And the mining ministry and Fani Botha sued him for extortion, and it led to a massive trial involving all sorts of figures, including F.W. de Klerk, who later became major players in the South African government. But most importantly, this trial documented the precise details of this uranium for tritium deal. It also documented the fact that the Israeli government had funneled money to Fani Botha during the key months of this deal because they feared that Fani Botha was facing personal bankruptcy, and if that were exposed, it would kill his political career, he would lose his key portfolio in the mining ministry, and the deal might not go through. And so the trial, which was kept classified for many, many years, documents that through a middleman, the Israeli government funneled money to Fani Botha in order to keep him solvent until the deal went through so that he didn't lose his portfolio. So that was the quid pro quo in this uranium-tritium deal. Let me talk briefly about some of the other issues that have been raised here. Obviously, the focus of my book is narrower than the discussion that we've had here today. I don't necessarily share the view that Washington is another occupied territory, nor do I believe that AIPAC was as malignant an actor in the 1980s as others have suggested. One of the interesting episodes that occurred in the 1980s actually casts a rather favorable light on AIPAC and is relevant to our discussion today. And that was the moment when the United States Congress, including people like Wolpe, who Jeff mentioned earlier, were pushing for strong anti-apartheid sanctions. And in 1986, the Congress eventually did pass a relatively strong sanctions bill called the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. And at this point in time, the Reagan administration was carrying on a policy that was called constructive engagement and was not particularly harsh on the South African apartheid regime. And many activist groups in the United States and many in Congress in both parties rejected this approach and called for divestment from South Africa, forceful sanctions, and in October 1986, they got their way, and Congress actually passed this bill. Reagan vetoed the bill. Congress overrode that veto almost immediately, and the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act became law. Now, why is this interesting in the Israeli context? It's interesting because at this moment in history, Israel is the primary and most important arms supplier to South Africa, after many other countries that had been supplying arms to the apartheid regime have pulled back. And so there was an amendment, a little noticed amendment, in the 1986 Anti-Apartheid Act that threatened to cut off U.S. economic and military aid to any state that continued to violate the arms embargo against South Africa. Now, this was an explicit threat against Israel, and the Israelis reacted immediately, knowing that they faced this risk if they didn't impose sanctions of their own. So at that moment, various left-wing members of the Knesset, people like Yossi Beilin and some of his affiliates, people like Alon Liel, who subsequently became an ambassador to South Africa, people who had always been morally opposed to the alliance with South Africa really started to make their argument publicly and to urge people like Peres and Rabin to stop selling arms to South Africa on moral grounds. Now, with this amendment in the U.S. Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, they were able to argue on purely realist grounds that Israel now faced a threat and that they needed to impose sanctions of their own. And that is what happened eventually. Now, AIPAC, at this time, also tried to convince the Israeli government to impose sanctions because initially they resisted. The Israeli government, especially key figures like Yitzhak Shamir and Shimon Peres, who had always been committed to the relationship with South Africa, and Yitzhak Rabin, who believed that it would cost hundreds of thousands of jobs in the Israeli defense industry and cause an economic crisis that he and others would be held politically responsible for, did not want to cut off the South Africans. And so the pressure from the left within the Israeli government, coupled with the pressure from the U.S. Congress, was heightened by AIPAC's own urging, saying that you guys are risking your relationship with some of the most pro-Israel members of Congress, and you need to impose sanctions on South Africa immediately. And they continued to resist until Reagan had his veto overridden. And essentially at that point, Shamir came to AIPAC officials in Washington and said, I didn't listen to you before because your president told me not to listen to you, but now I have to listen to you because he's had his veto overridden, and this is real. And at that point, in 1987, Israel actually did impose sanctions on South Africa. Ironically, if you look at the arms purchasing data from the South African government, the trade actually spikes in 1988 and 89, the 2 years immediately after Israeli sanctions. And the reason for that is that most military contracts last for many years, often over a decade. And so the sanctions bill in Israel stipulated no new arms contracts between Israel and South Africa, but they did not cancel the existing contracts. And so what you see in 1988 and 1989 is an effort to exhaust all existing contracts as fast as possible and finish the dealings that were already underway. And so there's a massive spike in military trade between the two countries in 88 and 89, and then in the early 1990s, it finally starts to trail off. And there was actually still trade up until the eve of Nelson Mandela's inauguration in 1994, but because of the exhaustive contracts and also because of pressure from the George H.W. Bush administration, pressure on the Israelis to stop violating their own sanctions and really cut off the South Africans for real, this relationship went into decline after 1990 and really ended in 1994. I'm just going to make a couple of very brief comments on the questions regarding the future. I think that most discussions of the Iranian nuclear threat in the popular media in Israel, and to some extent in this country as well, ignore one of the key questions, one of the key strategic questions. If you read columns in Israel and you talk to people on the street in Israel, the attitude is largely characterized by fear. Iran wants to destroy us. They're seeking a nuclear weapons capability. And the sense that you get from talking to the man on the street is, we think that once they have one, they're going to use it against us. Now, anyone who's spent some time studying deterrence and the history of nuclear weapons in the world knows that this is highly unrealistic, and that Iran is not such an irrational actor that they would come and use their first device by taking it, putting it in a plane and dropping it on Tel Aviv and subjecting themselves to the threat of a massive counterattack from a country with a much more advanced and extensive arsenal. And so the real question then becomes, what is the Israeli fear? What is the fear within the Israeli security establishment? And I think the more interesting question is Israel simply afraid of losing its nuclear hegemony in the region? And it has for so long been the only state with this capability, and it has had such a massive comparative advantage in that regard, that this tips the balance in a way that alters the strategic landscape irrevocably and threatens Israel in ways, and presents a lot of new uncertainties in terms of the possibility of a nuclear cascade in the Gulf from Sunni Arab states that feel threatened by an Iranian capability. And so I think that when we talk about the future of Israel's nuclear policy and whether Israel is going to maintain nuclear ambiguity or abandon its so-called opaque nuclear posture and come clean, so to speak, these are the real questions that I think people in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are going to be talking about. And as much as Grant focused in his talk on what this means for Americans and what this means for us in Washington, I think the more important question, if we're talking about Israel's nuclear future, is whether this is ever going to be an open debate in Israel. Because it hasn't ever been. I mean, going back to the 1950s and 60s, when the nuclear program was first being developed, this was discussed only at the highest levels. Even military officials were cut out of the discussions. It was key Ben-Gurion aides, it was the scientific establishment, the intelligence establishment, but the public in Israel and the press in Israel has never really had the opportunity to discuss the nuclear program. And one of the things that surprised me when my book came out, and there was a pretty vicious reaction against it in Israel, initially from Shimon Peres, who denied all of the allegations in the book regarding his participation in discussions with South African defense officials, specifically discussions at which the possible transfer of nuclear weapons from Israel to South Africa came up in 1975. So Peres reacted by denying all of this. The Israeli press was very critical of the allegations in the book, but at the same time they were quite eager to discuss the issue. And the reason for that is that they never had the opportunity to openly discuss Israel's nuclear weapons program if they initiate the discussion themselves because of censorship rules and because of the taboo surrounding this issue and the taboo on discussing this issue in Israel. But if a foreigner or if an Israeli citizen like Avner Cohen writes a book and publishes it with an American publisher, or if I as an American citizen write a book talking about Israel's nuclear weapons capability, the Israeli press is free to re-report it as they like and to have an open discussion about it. And I think that that's what's always been lacking in Israel, and what you may see now is an actual public debate over the benefits or drawbacks of nuclear ambiguity in Israel. And in my opinion, it's that debate that is going to drive the future of this policy. And if it is going to be maintained, it's going to be because the Israelis make that decision in an open and public debate. And if it's going to be abandoned, it's going to come as a result of that debate within Israel. And so I think what we really need to be watching for in the next few months and the coming year or two is to see whether the Israeli government is going to actually talk about this and allow people in Israel to openly talk about it and debate it. And I'm not so sure that anything's going to change very soon, and I don't think that it's very likely that the Israeli government is going to willingly cut back or abandon an arsenal that it sees as a key to its own security. But I do think what you might see is an open debate for the first time, and that is the first step in the direction of abandoning opacity and starting to talk about potential Israeli participation in a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. It's going to have to start with that debate. So on that note, I think I've gone on for too long. I welcome any questions when we're done, but thank you.
I'd like to thank Grant for inviting me and all of you for coming out here to me talk. He asked me to put on my strategist hat and talk about the whole subject of Israeli nuclear weapons more from the point of view of military strategy or international relations theory, and not so much in terms of the Israel lobby, which I, of course, have written about with Steve Walt. What I want to do is ask 4 questions and then answer them. First is, why did Israel develop nuclear weapons to begin with in the 1950s and 1960s? Second, does it make sense today for Israel to have a nuclear deterrent? Third, does opacity make good strategic sense for Israel? Does it matter for the United States? And then fourth, is it in America's interest for Israel to have nuclear weapons? Well, those are the 4 questions I want to answer. And you want to remember, when I answer those first 2 questions about why Israel developed nuclear weapons, I'm going to approach it from Israel's point of view. This will become clearer as I go along, but Israel and the United States are separate countries, and sometimes what's good for Israel is not good for the United States. On the question of Israel and nuclear weapons, let me start with a general point. The reason that states want nuclear weapons in almost all cases is because they are the ultimate deterrent. They make it almost impossible for an adversary or an opponent to attack your homeland and threaten the survival of your state. The obvious reason that if you have nuclear weapons and your survival is at risk, that's one clear circumstance under which you're likely to use those nuclear weapons. Many people now argue, here in Washington especially, that nuclear weapons have offensive capability, and if Iran were to get nuclear weapons, it could use those weapons to dominate the Gulf, establish hegemony in the region. This is not a serious argument. And of course, there are not many serious arguments that take place about Iran here inside the Beltway, as you well know. But the idea that they're going to use nuclear weapons to dominate the Gulf it's a laugher. It's also important to understand that even if you have nuclear weapons, it doesn't mean that other countries won't attack you. Again, I'm arguing that if you have nuclear weapons, they won't attack your homeland and threaten your survival. But you want to remember that in 1973, even though Israel had nuclear weapons, and the Syrians and the Egyptians understood that Israel had nuclear weapons, those two Arab states did initiate the famous October War or Yom Kippur War. So nuclear deterrence has its limits. Now, I think a powerful case can be made that it made good strategic sense for Israel to acquire nuclear weapons in the 1950s and the 1960s. One, because of the strategic environment that they operated in, and two, for historical reasons. With regard to the strategic environment, at that point in time, and again we're talking about the 50s and the early 60s when this program was set in motion, Israel's conventional forces relative to its neighbors were nowhere near as powerful as they now are. The gap between Israeli conventional forces and the neighbors' conventional forces was significant then, but nowhere near as great as it is today. At the same time, both Egypt and Syria, for much of that period, had very close relations with the Soviet Union, which was supplying them with arms. And as most of you know, the special relationship between the United States and Israel did not get going until 1967. And I would argue it was really not until after the 1973 war that the special relationship really began to take off. So relations between the United States and Israel were not very close at the time. The Soviet Union was a key player in the region, and Egypt and Syria, who were seen as client states of the Soviet Union, were quite formidable adversaries. I don't want to overstate the case. But nevertheless, given that strategic environment, and given the history of the Jews, especially in Europe, and especially given the fact that the Holocaust was recent history at the time, you can understand full well why the Israelis wanted to acquire a nuclear weapon. Had I been a national security advisor to David Ben-Gurion, I would have pushed him down the nuclear road back in the 50s and the 60s. The question, though, and Sasha raised this, is whether it makes sense today for Israel to have a nuclear deterrent. I think it's obvious that if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, it would make little sense for Israel to give up its nuclear deterrent. In fact, you'd never get the Israelis to do that. But that's not the interesting question. The interesting question is, what should Israel do if Iran abandons its nuclear enrichment capability and agrees to a comprehensive inspections regime? Would it then make sense for Israel to give up its nuclear arsenal? I think the answer to that question is not open and shut, but I think on balance, a powerful case could be made, or can be made, that Israel would be better off abandoning its nuclear deterrent. Now, why do I say that? Well, the argument for not giving it up is that they now have the ultimate deterrent. As you know, all states in the international system worry somewhat about their survival. The Israelis worry about their survival probably more than any other state in the system, for good reasons and bad reasons. But nevertheless, they worry. And given that they worry and that they have the ultimate deterrent, a powerful case can be made they should give it up, or not give it up. But I think there are more powerful arguments on the other side. First of all, there's a fundamentally different strategic environment in place today than existed in the 50s and in the 60s. And it's much more favorable from Israel's point of view. The Soviet Union, as we all know, has gone away, and it is not supplying either Egypt or Syria or anybody in the neighborhood with a meaningful conventional fighting force. Furthermore, Egypt has changed its approach to dealing with Israel and is now effectively a relatively friendly state. It's not an adversary of Israel like it was in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s as well. And if you look at what's happened with regard to the special relationship, it's blossomed since 1973. And the United States and Israel today are basically joined at the hip. That wasn't the case back then. And related to that, the United States has supplied Israel with the most up-to-date conventional weaponry in its arsenal. And as a result of that fact, combined with the fact that the Soviets are no longer supplying the Egyptians and Syrians, the gap between the Israelis on one hand and the Arab states on the other, in terms of conventional weaponry, is just enormous. Right? No state in its right mind would pick a fight with the Israelis. And every time it looks like the Syrians and the Israelis might get into a fight, the Syrians are backtracking like the best cornerback or safety in the NFL. It's really quite amazing. Nobody in their right mind would pick a fight with the IDF in that neck of the woods. So I think in terms of the strategic environment, conventional deterrence alone takes care of the Israelis. The other important reason for thinking about getting rid of Israeli nuclear weapons is to discourage or to prevent proliferation in the region. I think the Israelis understand full well that there is significant pressure on Iran. There will eventually be significant pressure in Iraq again once we get out of there, and especially if Iran develops nuclear weapons of its own, to get nuclear weapons. You can posit plausible scenarios as to how nuclear proliferation occurs in the Middle East over the next 50 years. And I think it's clearly not in Israel's interest to have nuclear proliferation. I think given Israel's conventional superiority, number one, number two, given its close relationship with the United States, it's not likely to change anytime soon, and given the dangers associated with proliferation, I think the Israelis would be better off in a nuclear-free Middle East. But of course, that's not going to happen because the Israeli government is so far to the right and dominated by hardliners to the point where that's virtually unthinkable in the near future. But nevertheless, I think a good case can be made for pursuing that policy. This brings me to the third question, the matter of opacity. Does opacity make sense for Israel? And to a lesser extent, what are the consequences for the United States? Just let me say what I think we mean when we talk about opacity. This is where a country has nuclear weapons, but it doesn't admit explicitly that it has those weapons, and it even hints that it might not have them. And of course, this is what the Israelis have been doing for decades now. My first question about opacity is, who are you fooling? Very important question. Who's being fooled here? It seems quite clear to me that the elites in the Arab world, the elites in Europe, and the elites in the United States, and by elites I mean policymakers, experts, and even the informed public, people who pay attention to this when they go home at night and read the newspaper and read books and magazines, none of them are being fooled. We all kind of figured out a long time ago that Israel has nuclear weapons. And I've never talked to any intelligent person who pays careful attention to Middle East politics who tried to pretend to me that Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons. Indeed, we all talk as if Israel had nuclear weapons. And in fact, if you think about it, the Israelis, because they acquired those nuclear weapons for deterrence purposes, want policymakers in the Arab world and want the Americans and wanted the Soviets during the Cold War to know that they had nuclear weapons. And in fact, I think they wanted them to be quite certain they had them and to let them know that they would use them because that's what makes deterrence work. So I don't think you were fooling the experts. Now, one might argue that one of the advantages of this is just to create a little ambiguity in the minds of elites. And then in a crisis, you drag out the weapons and make it clear you would use them. One could argue that this is what happened in the 1973 war. But that's not a very smart strategy, because if you're the Israelis, you want to avoid crises. You want to avoid the 1973 war. So you want to make it pretty clear, if not very clear, to the elites that you have these things. And they've done that. So again, the question is, who are they fooling? Now, one might argue that this policy is good for allowing the elites in the Arab and Islamic world, especially in countries like Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, to resist pressure from the public. Because when people down below begin to holler about the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons, the elites can say it's not clear that they have nuclear weapons. So what this policy of opacity provides is plausible deniability. I guess you can make that argument. It was probably somewhat effective in the past, but I don't think it's very effective now, in large part because of the internet. I'm a big believer that the internet has been a game changer, and if you rely on the mainstream media, mainstream publications for your information, you're not going to learn very much about Middle East politics, especially when it comes to Israel. But we have all of these websites and blogs, and we have the Israeli press and so forth and so on, where you can just learn all sorts of things about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Middle East politics more generally that you can't learn in the mainstream media here in the United States. And the end result of this is, I think, the cat is out of the bag on this one, and everybody kind of understands it. So the Israelis can pretend, and we can pretend, that it doesn't matter. I mean, that Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons, but I don't think it buys you very much. Now, to pick up on Grant's comments, he indicated that it may help in the United States because it allows policymakers in Washington to pretend that Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons. And he was complaining about the fact that this policy of opacity undermines accountability. I don't think so. I don't think it matters much at all, because there's no accountability for Israel on any issue. They don't need opacity. Listen, if I went to the Middle East and visited Israel and I was killed, somebody shot me there, do you think there'd be any accountability? Seriously. If any of you went to the Middle East and were killed, do you think there'd be accountability? There wouldn't be. This is how outrageous this situation is. Just think about the Liberty. Think about Rachel Corrie. Think about this Turkish American who was just killed in the flotilla. There's no accountability. The Israelis can do almost anything and get away with it. So the idea that opacity matters, I don't think so. The lobby basically believes it can finesse any issue. They've never seen an issue that they can't finesse. Look at what they did with the Goldstone report. Judge Goldstone, right? I followed this issue very carefully, and he asked me to put my strategist hat on. As many of you know, I went to West Point. I was in the military for 10 years, and I cut my teeth in this business by doing military matters. The first time I ever went to Israel was to study what happened in the 67, 73, and actually the 56 wars. And I can tell you in great detail how those wars were fought. And I followed what happened in Gaza in 2008, 2009. Judge Goldstone, if anything, was too soft on the Israelis. Anybody who followed this carefully knows that he basically got the story right. And again, to the extent it was wrong, he should have been tougher on the Israelis. But you saw what happened to Judge Goldstone. This is how powerful the lobby is. Alan Dershowitz was correct, right, when he said that Jews of my generation created what is perhaps the most powerful interest group in the history of democracy. Remarkably powerful interest group. So I think you don't want to put too much emphasis on opacity. It matters on the margins, or it mattered once on the margins, but not very much. This brings me to the final subject. Is it in Israel's interest for Israel to have nuclear weapons? Now, it's very important to understand that Israel's supporters in the United States go to enormous lengths to make the argument that there's no difference between Israel's interests and America's interests. Because once you open the possibility that the two countries have different interests, then they're forced to choose in a very public fashion. And of course, they'll invariably choose Israel's interests over America's interests. And that is not something that they want to have happen in public. Right? And this is why they've gone to great lengths to create this situation where it looks like Obama and Netanyahu have patched up all their differences, and to the extent that there are differences, they'll be handled behind closed doors, because they don't want those differences out in the open. But of course, as we all know, no two countries have the same interests. There's nothing to do with Israel or the United States. It's just the way international politics works. There are going to be cases where it's in Israel's interest to do certain things and not in America's interest to allow Israel to do those things. And there is no issue, I believe, where that is clearer than the nuclear issue. As I made clear in my opening set of remarks, I do believe it was in Israel's interest to develop nuclear weapons. By the way, I think it's in Iran's interest today to develop nuclear weapons. If I was President Ahmadinejad's national security advisor and he asked me what to do, I would tell him to acquire a nuclear deterrent. Is that in America's interest? Absolutely not. Iran and the United States have different interests. No two states have the same interests. I believe it was in Israel's interest to acquire nuclear weapons, and I'm hardly surprised at all the activities that the Israelis engaged in that Grant so eloquently described. That's the way states behave in the international system, and they go to great lengths to disguise their behavior. Okay? But it was not then in America's interest for Israel to acquire nuclear weapons, and it is not in our interest now for Israel to have nuclear weapons. This is why, as Grant described, President Kennedy went to great lengths to prevent Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons and to get them to join the NPT. And President Johnson was a very, very interesting figure on this whole subject of U.S.-Israeli relations. President Johnson may have been willing to give Israel a green light or an orange light, however you want to characterize it. But you can see from Grant's comments and from reading the literature on this that down below all sorts of people were protesting, and all sorts of people in the national security establishment wanted to go to great lengths to stop Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons. Because again, it wasn't in our interest. And the two best examples that show how it's not in our interest is what happened during the 1973 war. During that conflict, you all remember the Israelis looked like they were in dire straits in the first few days, and they wanted the United States to immediately resupply them. The Nixon administration said no, because the Nixon administration judged quite correctly that once the Israelis recovered from the initial surprise, they would do very well. And therefore the U.S. government did not want to give the Israelis at that point more arms. The Israelis then threatened to pull the nuclear weapons out and began talking about using nuclear weapons. That, not surprisingly, spooked the Americans, who immediately began resupplying the Israelis, even though they did not want to do that. That's a form of nuclear coercion. From Israel's point of view, it was a smart policy. From our point of view, it was not good. And then the second example is what's recently been going on with regard to nuclear proliferation. It's quite clear, and you see this from the recent review conference, that the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons, and again, we're not fooling anybody with this opaque rhetoric. The fact that Israel has nuclear weapons is making it very difficult for the United States to stem the tide on proliferation and to move to a nuclear-free Middle East. So again, it's just not in our interest, and it would have been much better if we could, from our point of view, if we could have prevented Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons. Let me just conclude with a few words on where this situation is headed. I actually believe that the situation is going to get much worse over time. I believe that we're not going to have an Israeli-Palestinian peace settlement. I believe that talk of a two-state solution and all this talk about moving from proximity talks to direct talks is a charade. I find it hard to believe that people in this town take this discussion seriously at this point in time. You're going to get a greater Israel, and it either is or is going to be an apartheid state. It is going to cause us enormous problems in the Middle East or in the Arab and Islamic world, and it's going to continue to keep relations between Israel and its neighbors in a troublesome state. On the proliferation front, I would not be surprised if Iran and other countries continue to move down the nuclear road. You already see the Jordanians expressing interest in developing a significant nuclear enrichment capability. It'll be interesting to see what Turkey does. As I said to you before, I believe that Iraq will want nuclear weapons if Iran has nuclear weapons. They'd be foolish not to, from an Iraqi point of view. A Middle East where more than one state has nuclear weapons makes me very, very nervous. And of course, what this is all going to point to is the fact that America's interests and Israel's interests are going to continue to diverge. And the end result of that back here in the United States is that the lobby is going to have to work overtime to cover that up and make it look like everything is hunky-dory, when in fact it's not. And that has all sorts of negative consequences for domestic politics. So I think things are very bad now, but I'm sad to say they're only going to get worse.
Office with RTTV. I want to direct my questions to Mr. Mearsheimer and Mr. Smith. First, I wanted to say that in America's defense, I'm so sorry, it's America's defense line, foreign agents, and spy trade have been a tremendous help for me in looking into this subject, so I thank Mr. Smith very much for his excellent contributions on this subject. And I wanted to ask if anything's being done today from the law enforcement agencies to both register Israel as a foreign agent, but also get them on board to sign the NPT. And to Mr. Mearsheimer, how is the Israel lobby trying to counteract anything that's happening in regards to registering Israel, the Israel lobby, and other elements here in Washington as foreign agents, and getting them to sign on to the NPT? Thank you.
I don't think that the lobby has to do much these days to head off pressure on Israel to sign the NPT. There's hardly any pressure on Israel to sign the NPT, and there's not going to be any pressure in the immediate future. And with regard to getting organizations like AIPAC to be categorized as agents for a foreign government, I think there's hardly any pressure at this point on that either. So I don't think that this is, an issue that the lobby worries much about any more than the NPT issue.
I'll just take the question about foreign agent registration. There are a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who believe that as a direct outgrowth of AIPAC, or the American Zionist Council, that AIPAC should be registering as a foreign agent. There was a high-level meeting with the Department Department of Justice Foreign Agents Registration Act Foreign Agents Registration section last November, in which a 386-page case for registration was made in a 2-hour meeting. To date, there have been some more mainly unilateral discussions, but there's no indication that'll be happening anytime soon.
Next question, yes, sir.
George Hishmi here. There's a statement from the UAE ambassador in London, authorized or not, I'm not sure, that he favors Israel bombard Iran with a nuke. What are the chances of that? Can you make any comments? And before you do, I don't know much about nuclear weapons. What does it involve? How large is the area it would involve if you drop a nuclear weapon? I mean, if you drop a nuclear weapon on Amman, will the effect be felt in Tel Aviv, for instance, or Cairo, or Lebanon, or what is the? If you could combine these two questions together.
I think a lot depends on the size of the nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
And there's no question that if you have a big nuclear weapon and it's a dirty nuclear weapon, you could easily destroy a city like Amman. The fallout would be tremendous, and from Israel's point of view, using nuclear weapons against any of its neighbors would make no sense because of the fallout. This is one of the reasons, as I said before, these weapons don't have much offensive capability. The idea that Iran is going to get these weapons and use them is extremely unlikely. As Sasha said, in the context of Iran using them against Israel, if Iran were to use nuclear weapons against Israel, Israel would incinerate Iran, and in fact would incinerate almost all of Iran's neighbors. So these weapons do massive damage. That's why they're called weapons of mass destruction, and they're of little utility in that particular region because of the close proximity of Israel to everyone else. With regard to attacking Iran, I don't think either the Israelis, and certainly the Americans, are talking about using nuclear weapons to launch that attack. What they're talking about is using conventional weapons to take out Iran's nuclear enrichment capability. What do I think the likelihood is that either the Americans or the Israelis will do that? I would argue it is very low, in large part because the last thing the Americans need at this point in time is another war with another country in the Arab and Islamic world, especially a country that borders both Afghanistan and Iraq, where the United States is waging wars where it's not doing too well. If we were to bomb Iran would have very powerful incentives to make our problems in Iraq and Afghanistan even greater. So I find it hard to imagine that we would do that. But as you well know from having watched the Israelis over the years, the Israelis love to use military force to deal with their problems. And then the question becomes, how good are the Americans at blocking the Israelis when they want to do something? And there the record is pretty clear that we're not very good.
Another question, yes.
The Jerusalem Fund. I just had a question concerning the idea of American aid going to the nuclear program in Israel. In terms of privatization and offshore accounts and sort of that channel being something that aids the program, is there any evidence that, U.S. government spending, like the international affairs budget or foreign military financing, that goes to Israel, that any of that is used in the nuclear program? And if there isn't evidence, is there any accountability to make sure that that doesn't happen?
And who's the question addressed to?
Whoever has numbers, maybe Mr. Smith or Dr. Polikoff.
I don't have any numbers, and everything we've written about has really made the case that by providing massive conventional aid, the biggest recipient of U.S. aid, of the foreign aid budget, that's offsetting any resources devoted to running the nuclear program. So we haven't found any smoking guns, any secret accounts or anything like that, but the argument can be made that because we're providing so much other support, it frees up an awful lot of resources.
just respond briefly. My knowledge of this question is much more historical, so I don't know how useful this response will be. But one interesting case from the 50s and 60s is that there was actually widespread opposition to the nuclear program within the IDF during the early days. And what you saw at that point was conventional, many generals within the IDF saying, we need money for boots and bullets, and you guys are sinking all of this money into a pipe dream before it actually came to be. And it was that debate between the traditional generals and the young idealistic technocrats, people like Perez, that characterized the face-off in the early days. And of course, because Ben-Gurion was behind the program, it went through, but that debate's been largely forgotten. And I think that there may be somewhat of a residual debate like that today, but I'm not familiar with what's going on behind the scenes right now in that debate. And then in terms of actual U.S. material, I mean, I think that this NUMEC case is probably the hardest evidence that exists of an actual diversion, but even in the Galinsky-Madsen article, the question is left open to what extent the U.S. government was actually instrumental and to what extent it was done behind the U.S. government's back. And I think in this particular case, as in with any case involving espionage and transfers of sensitive materials, you have to ask whether the government was acting monolithically. And obviously there were cross-cutting pressures and disagreements within the U.S. government, just as there were in the Israeli government and in the South African government when these sorts of transfers took place. I mean, the episode that I talked about, the South African uranium going to Israel, I mean, there were people within South Africa's Atomic Energy Commission who resisted that and saw it as a blatant act of proliferation. And so and likewise, there were people in the U.S. government during the NUMEC case who felt that way.
Just a follow-up question on that. I was curious, it's a fascinating history you described with the early dealing between Israel and South Africa. But with Israel so concerned about its sovereignty in dealing with the United States, I was puzzled by Israel accepting this 500 tons of yellow cake at South Africa's request and just not doing anything with it for such a period of time. I'm not clear why that would have happened.
Sure. No, it's an interesting question and something that I thought about as I was researching this. I think the simplest answer is that it was seen as an insurance policy in the early days, and they knew that they had a reliable supply, and they were quite comfortable with what they had, and it wasn't until the mid-1970s that Israel really started to feel vulnerable. And when they made the request to lift the safeguards in 76, it was because they had exhausted their other materials and actually needed what had just been a sort of savings account up until that point. But there's another historical element here about that particular moment in history that I think is important to remember. When U.S.-Israel relations started to deteriorate a few months ago with Biden's visit to Israel and the expansion of East Jerusalem settlements, everyone said, oh, this is the biggest crisis since Baker in 1991, and people named various crises, and one of the ones that came up was 1975, and it's a crisis that a lot of people forget, but it's an important one, and that's when President Ford said that he refused to finance a state of deadlock in the Middle East because Israeli-Egyptian negotiations were stalling over Sinai, and Ford and Kissinger got fed up, and for 6 months in 1975, the U.S. cut aid to Israel off. And this was a moment when Israel felt extremely vulnerable and worried that their special relationship with the U.S. that had felt quite firm since the Yom Kippur War might be disappearing. And it was precisely at this point that they really stepped up their trade and their high-level negotiations with South Africa. And Israeli generals who participated in those talks at the time talked about seeing South Africa as a sort of third leg to stand on, was the terminology they used. Not in the sense that South Africa could replace the United States as a weapons supplier, but they saw South Africa as a state that could both be a major export market, which was a huge issue for the Israeli defense industry, and a state that could finance joint research and development for advanced weapon systems that Israel wasn't able to finance on its own. So in that context, in 76, the moment we're talking about is a moment of heightened vulnerability, and I think that is why you see Israel asking for it at precisely that point.
You have to go and make a comment on that. It's interesting, in 1976 there was an organization founded called JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, whose goal seemed to be to make the U.S. and American military-industrial complexes so entwined together, so closely entwined together that no president could unravel it. And they got many admirals, generals, major officers retired as part of their program. Did you see any JINSA connection? Investigate anything at all with that?
Not relative to the South Africa stuff. I mean, I'm familiar with the organization, but I wasn't aware that it was founded at precisely that point.
It was founded in '76, so it was significant because there was that concern. That was the time that Gerald Ford had announced that he was going to do a reassessment of U.S.-Israel policy, to make a major speech, and that was when AIPAC had their first famous letter of 76 U.S. senators from across the political spectrum, with McGovern and Kennedy on the left, so to speak, and Orrin Hatch and Connie Mack on the right, warning President Ford not to do anything to jeopardize the particular relationship between Israel and the United States. And also, we recently have seen, but not publicized, that 87 senators sent a letter to President Obama saying that the Israel-U.S. relationship should not be jeopardized. We have to stand together with Israel in support of the blockade of Gaza and against Turkey. And in this question, I'd like to bring it, you mentioned it, Professor Mearsheimer, about the relationship with Turkey, which has been a long-time strategic ally, and perhaps you could answer a question. What do you think is going to happen with the U.S.-Turkish relationship on the basis of this current crisis?
Well, it seems quite clear at this point in time that relations between Turkey and Israel will continue to deteriorate. I mean, the Turkish foreign minister has made it very clear to Israel in a very public way that Israel has two choices. One, it can apologize, or two, it can allow for an international investigation. And absent one of those two outcomes, the Turks will consider breaking off relations with Israel. Now, even if they don't break off relations with Israel, relations between the two countries are definitely going to get even worse than they are now if you don't get either an apology or a international commission. And I find it hard to believe that the Israelis will apologize, at least in a serious way. And I find it hard to believe that they would agree to another Goldstone report. I mean, they created this charade in Israel that we're backing. I mean, it's really quite amazing. So I think relations between those two countries will deteriorate, and the end result will be that enormous pressure will be brought to bear on the American government to get tough with the Turks. The lobby will work overtime. I mean, I have a file that's about 1.5 inches thick on this, and it's all of the usual suspects making the case against Turkey, and even raising the possibility of pushing Turkey out of NATO, and in effect punishing it for being so brazen as to go against the Israelis. The question is, what will the Turks do? I again find it hard to believe that the Turks will buckle at this point in time. So I think that U.S.-Turkish relations will get worse. This is just another example of the extent to which Israel is an albatross around their neck. And if you go around town here and you get behind closed doors with people, huge numbers of people in this city understand this full well. This is no secret, but people are just afraid to voice their concerns publicly because they know the end result will be that their careers may be destroyed. This is not a good situation.
Any questions? Yes, Blue.
I was wondering about, you don't really hear about it, with the Turkey issue. Because we're both members of NATO, are we under any certain
Hold the microphone closer to your face, please.
are we under certain kind of obligations because Israel's not part of that. And that probably Mr. Mearsheimer would be the best answer of that. And then for everybody, I'm just wondering, because outside of trying to counter the now defunct Cold War case with Syria and Angola with the South Africa thing, what is there any benefit to the United States for giving $3.5 billion a year to Israel? Because I don't see it.
Take them in the order that you presented them. First of all, the Israeli attack on the flotilla in international waters was an attack on a NATO member. And according to the NATO charter, all of the other members of NATO should have come to the defense of Turkey. But of course, that didn't happen, and we know why it didn't happen. With regard to giving all that money to Israel, Israel has a modern industrial economy, and it doesn't qualify as a poor country that merits that kind of support. The reason it gets that support is because the lobby is so powerful on Capitol Hill. Now, if we gave Israel $3 billion a year and we gained some leverage for giving them that money, it might not be so bad. In other words, we could say to the Israelis, you either stop building settlements or we'll cut off the $3 billion. That would be a good idea, in my opinion. And by the way, in my opinion, it would be in Israel's interest. But the fact of the matter is, we give them $3 billion no matter what they do. So they can do almost anything they want, and Barack Obama is not going to threaten to cut off the $3 billion. You've noticed that Obama has not talked at all about doing that, because that's the way the special relationship works. The special relationship says, in effect, Israel can do whatever it wants, and we will back them to the hilt.
Last question, sir.
My name is Reg Jones. In your statement and in your speech, you comment on the inevitability of a greater Israel. And then a few moments ago, you talked about the same thing. And I'd just like to hear your comments on what you envision as a likely sequence of events that will happen to lead to a greater Israel that's apartheid.
Well, have you been to the West Bank or to Gaza? I think it's very important for anybody who's not been there, who gets an opportunity to go to Israel, just to go to the West Bank. And when you go to the West Bank, you can get into taxi cabs that have either yellow license plates or white license plates. You want to get into a taxi cab that has white license plates, because those are effectively the Palestinian taxi cabs. And just drive around the West Bank, and you'll be stopped at all the relevant checkpoints, and you'll get a feel for what it's like. And then get in a yellow cab, and that'll allow you to move freely around the West Bank and just see what life is like there. The Israelis control the West Bank, and they effectively control Gaza. Gaza is a giant open-air prison. While all this settlement building and all this road building is taking place, has been taking place, is taking place, and will continue to take place, doing, is it's allowing the Israelis to increase their control over the West Bank. And what this means for the Palestinians is that they're basically being reduced to living in a handful of impoverished enclaves. And their movement from enclave to enclave is greatly restricted by the checkpoints, by the fact that there are roads on which they're not allowed to go, the fact that they have virtually no control over the water underneath them, and certainly no control over the air above them. They basically live in Bantustans. This is a disastrous situation. By the way, for those of you who read Sasha's excellent book, you should read his concluding chapter, where he talks about the parallels between Israel and South Africa, pointing out quite correctly that there are differences as well as similarities. But nevertheless, from Israel's point of view, this is a disastrous situation. This is, again, the point that Olmert was making. And when Jimmy Carter made the argument Israel is on the verge of becoming an apartheid state, he got pilloried, right? But leave Jimmy Carter aside, leave John Mearsheimer aside. The fact is that Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak and countless other Israelis have made the same point, that if you don't get a two-state solution, if the Palestinians don't get a viable state of their own, right, and you instead create this greater Israel, which means that Israel controls all the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, i.e. the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinians are confined to these enclaves or bantustans, call them what you want, you will have what is effectively an apartheid state. It won't look exactly like South Africa for reasons that Sasha delineates in his book, but it will look very similar. And how are you going to defend an apartheid state in the Western world? It's going to be extremely difficult to do. And again, this Olmert was saying that once you get an apartheid state, that will be the end of Israel. That's what he was saying. It's not going to work in the same way that white South Africa, over the long term, was not defensible. Anyway, this gets back to my point that what Obama should have done, if he was clever, was he should have gone over the heads of the lobby, not picked a fight with the lobby, not picked a fight with the Israelis, and gone to the American Jewish community and to the American people in general and made the argument that I'm laying out to you right here. And he should have used Ehud Olmert's rhetoric. He should have used Ehud Barak's rhetoric. He should have made it clear that there are many hardline Israelis, and Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak are hardliners. They're not, softies like Yossi Beck.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer. I'd like to big hands for our speakers today. Thank you all for coming on behalf of the Mordechai Benunu Open Nuclear Dialogue Initiative, and we have to...